What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. I am so excited for today's episode because in today's episode, we're going to be starting a little mini series here on the channel called Trouble Points. The first thing we're going to talk about in today's episode is building softer soil naturally. A lot of gardeners get this mix up, which is I have to till my soil to build softer soil. And there's a lot of gardeners that have come on recently saying, no-till gardening is the future. No-till gardening is the way to go. And a lot of people try this no-till gardening method and find out very quickly that in reality, it does not meet up with their expectations, which is I'm going to apply these things to my soil, I'm going to let them sit, and I'm just going to be able to plant right in them and grow. The biggest problem with compaction is there's no air, there's no light, there's no looseness, there's no fluffiness. And so it can compact, it can basically just smush down because there's no structure there, there's no framework. And so when you till the soil, you give it temporary air, you give it temporary oxygen, but when it rains or it snows over winter, and then you come into the spring, or let's say the sun beats down it all summer long, what happens is over time, the settling actually occurs and it compacts and it compacts and it compacts and it becomes even stiffer. Because what happened is that you took that soil that was already stiff, you fluffed it up, and then when it rained, the rain carried away some sediment, the rain carried away some nutrients, some fertility. And then whatever was left there then is just compacts down. And that's how you get to actually have a worse state over time. And it creates a system of dependency where you're constantly tilling, you're constantly trying to loosen it up, and you're really actually fighting an uphill battle. And so a lot of gardeners in this trouble point are struggling with, well, if I till, I do get the results that I'm looking for, but not long term. But if I go no-till, I have to wait a super long time for my soil to be amended to the point that I can plant directly in without tilling. So I lose all of this time. Is there a hybrid? Is there something that I can use? And so that's really where this video is going to come into play, is if you want to go completely no-till, these methods are going to apply to you. If you want to do what is considered a hybrid gardening approach, which is something that I advocate because gardening is not a one-size-fits-all solution, and some people have great success with no-till. Other people, they need to combine, tilling temporarily with some more baby steps towards no-till as you go. And that is ultimately going to build your soil over time, helping it to create a better soil structure so you don't have to till later on. You might have to till for 1 or 2 years until your soil quality gets to the point that it can hold that structure. And once it holds that structure, anything you put on top of that is only going to make it better. So the first thing that gardeners turn to loosen their soil naturally is gypsum. Gypsum is a fantastic way to break up compacted and clay-filled soil. If your soil is very clay heavy, what you'll find is that those clay bonds are very tight and there's not a lot of oxygen. And so what happens is when it rains or you water, the water just runs right off the soil. It really does not soak into the soil as much. And so what clay has are very tight clay bonds. And these bonds are actually chemical bonds that need to be broken up. And gypsum is actually part calcium and part sulfur. It's actually calcium sulfate. And what happens is when you apply gypsum to clay, the gypsum actually works in between the clay molecules, helping to break it up. This helps to increase water penetration into the ground. And then once you have better water penetration, the water actually stays in the soil and helps the soil stay more mobile. What you'll find is that dry soil actually will compact more than wet soil will. Believe it or not, wet soil actually has water, little water molecules in that soil column, keeping things more loose. And as things are, still moving around, you'll see here, there's room for them to move. But as things dry out, the water leaves and things get more and more compacted and there's a lot less wiggle room. And so having a little bit of moisture in the soil really will go a long way to keeping the soil workable. And so gypsum is something that can really help. And farmers have been using gypsum for many, many, many years to loosen their soil. And it is by no means a perfect solution, but it is something that you can use in an overall gardening regimen to loosen your soil naturally. Gypsum does not contain the other things that create soil fertility. which is a key problem as to why your soil is compacting in the first place. Because the second thing that can help loosen your soil naturally is actually more likely what your soil is missing, and that's organic matter or compost. So organic matter or compost contains what is called humus. Now humus is what gardeners look for when they talk about really good quality soil. You see, when you have humus in your soil, humus is the leftover remnants of organic matter. As plant material breaks down, whatever it is, leaves, grass clippings, twigs, food scraps, there's an exoskeleton left over. That exoskeleton is like a sponge. So when you have a dish sponge and it's dry, all those little holes, okay, they hold on to water when it's wet. The same exact thing happens to the holes in humus. It acts just like a sponge. And so when it's given water, it holds on to that water really well. It also provides a home for beneficial bacteria and fungi, which once they're alive in the soil, helps to keep things more mobile. And so humus is a wonderful thing to add to your soil. But compost also contains beneficial nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. They add fertility to your soil, which helps increase the life in your soil. And so often, compacted soil does not contain life because there's a lot of components to the soil that are lacking that life requires. Life requires water to survive. Life requires oxygen to survive. Life requires food to survive. And so in clay soil and compacted soil, what you find is often void of life. How often do you dig and find earthworms in your soil? If you don't find many, that can be the problem. You know, earthworms come in to feed on partially broken down material like leaves and grass clippings and whatnot. They feed on that food, and the remains is worm castings, which is really good fertilizer. So if you don't have that life cycle, if you don't have that cycle of life going on inside of your garden, it's important that you fix that because that's what's usually missing. And so compost, what can happen is what it can do for your soil is compost can actually work in between the clay particles, in between those clay molecules, and break them up, much like gypsum can, only it's a far more permanent solution to the problem. Now I know that it's going to be asked, Luke, well, if I have compacted soil, how does it loosen it? Well, you can take one of two approaches. You can till in the compost into the compacted soil, and that will make sure to evenly incorporate it all so that you can have a garden much faster. Or what you can do is you can apply the compost directly on top of the soil as like a mulch. And that mulch over time will work down into the soil. As the water leaches through the compost, it will actually break up the clay as well. And then that will allow worms and other life, insects and fungi and stuff to come into the soil. And over time, they will actually mix, and over time, they will create softer soil. And that is, the key word there is over time. You know, doing a no-till approach, by just applying it right to your soil like that, will work, but don't expect it to happen overnight. And so that's another thing that a lot of gardeners get frustrated with is the over time little fine print there. But compost, in my opinion, is one of the best ways to loosen soil very quickly. So the third thing that you can do to soften your soil naturally is to keep it damp. Now, how do we do that? Well, you can water regularly, but that's not going to do a whole lot, especially if you already have compacted soil. That's just going to create mud. That's not really going to actually loosen your soil because it's not actually penetrating through the soil. So you have to do a couple things in order to get the water into the soil. You can use compost, you can use gypsum, and then you can water more regularly so you don't just create mud. Or what you can do is you can mulch. Now, mulching is what I'm actually doing here. I'm taking the compost, which is it's going to hold the moisture, but I'm also using it as an insulative barrier on top of the soil. So I am taking it and I'm applying it right to the top of this bed here. And we talk about this all the time when people talk about, Luke, how should I cover my soil? How should I mulch my soil? Should I use wood chip mulch? Should I use straw? And I always say, why don't you try compost? Compost can be a great mulch. And mulch, it acts as a protective barrier. When you talk about the purpose of mulch, it, 1, suppresses weeds, and 2, holds in soil moisture. All right, and the fourth and final way to soften your soil naturally, believe it or not, is to actually grow plants there. Yes, you heard that correct. By actually growing plants in a spot where you need to improve the soil quality, you can improve the soil quality. And that's because plant roots do one thing. They do one thing very well, and that is that they prevent erosion. There's a reason why people put grass seed on embankments, and that's because they don't want the topsoil sloughing off. Areas where there's no plants growing, there's usually very little topsoil. And so by planting plants there, it's going to help to retain the topsoil layer, which is the most important part of having healthy soil, because that is the part that contains the life. If you lose the topsoil, you lose the life. And so by planting plants there, it's going to help to retain the topsoil, which is very important. Also, plants do another thing very well. They help shade the soil. And shading soil acts just like a mulch. A living mulch can help protect the soil from evaporation, keeping it damp longer. Also, plants can create organic matter, specifically plants that don't take a whole lot of nutrients out of the soil, but actually give a net benefit back to the soil. These can be things like sunflowers, which generate tons of biomass. They actually create more organic matter than the nutrients they take out of the soil. They create a net positive. That's why a lot of farmers, when they're turning over their crops, they plant things like sunflowers, because once they mulch the sunflowers back into the soil, they know that the decaying sunflower plants are actually going to add a net benefit of organic matter to the soil. Other things like legumes and radishes are fantastic options. Legumes being like beans or peas, nitrogen fixers, because they don't require nitrogen in the soil, they take nitrogen from the air and they fix it in nodules in their roots. And when the plants grow and produce fruit, some of that nitrogen is used up from the roots, but any remaining is given back to the soil. And so they can actually provide a net positive benefit to the soil, as well as the organic matter that they create when they break down, meaning like compost and humus, like we just talked about. And so by planting plants there, you can actually have softer soil over time. It's just important to pick the right plants. If you plant a tomato and a pepper there, they're going to require a lot of nutrients, and they'll probably struggle, be stressed, and ultimately die, and they won't really have a huge benefit. But by planting the right types of plants, they could be a temporary crop that you grow in that area that overall will help the soil become better quality. You can also grow things, believe it or not, like weeds. Dandelions, purslane, a lot of your weedy ground cover plants do really well in depleted and poor quality soil. And dandelions have deep tap roots, which can help to break up that soil and help to add aeration. Farmers will grow things like radishes, another crop that we talked about, similarly to legumes, because daikon radishes have a really deep taproot. And if you don't harvest that radish, what happens is the radish rots. It creates a giant hole in the soil that worms and other things will eat that radish. It'll rot away. It'll create little pockets of organic matter where water can get into the soil. And it's the same thing, it's the same process as running a dibbler on your lawn. If you ever ran that little, or you see it on the golf course where they run that little tumbler that has little spikes on it and it pokes holes into the lawn, that allows water to percolate down through the soil, and water leads to soil mobility, which leads to softer soil. So it all comes around full circle, you see. So those are 4 ways to loosen your soil naturally. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. If you did, make sure to throw a like up there. It helps spread this video around. And certainly, if you have not yet subscribed, make sure to do that. We have lots more content coming out, as well as lots more videos in this ongoing series called Trouble Points. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Hopefully you learned something new. And as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel reminding you to grow big or go home. And we'll catch you all later. See ya. Bye.